Hi everyone, welcome back. Today's 3 stories all revolve around one moment that changes everything, when someone tries to assert authority they don't actually have. One coworker borrows the boss's words and immediately regrets it. One executive learns that rules can be followed a little too perfectly, and one small-time boss discovers that unpaid labor has a very long memory. Stick around until the end because we're going to compare all 3 and decide which one really delivered the best outcome. And I want you to vote in the comments on which story deserved the win. My coworker told me, "You might as well let me finish it myself," so I did. The whole crew watched in silence. I used to work on the loading dock of a fruit packing plant. The plant would get orders of a certain amount of heavy boxes of kinds and sizes of fruit, usually apples, and we'd use forklifts to bring our palletfuls of boxes from cold storage, reload those boxes by hand onto different pallets to fit the order, and then load the order into semi-trucks to be shipped. The apples were clean-ish, but the boxes and pallets were not, so it was dusty physical labor for sometimes more than 8 hours a day, but we all pulled our weight. One coworker was not always that bright, but had somehow convinced himself that he was smarter than the rest of us. Think assistant to the regional manager vibes. We were in the middle of loading an order, and it happened to fall to him to do most of the hand stacking, as it sometimes does, while the rest of us were finishing other necessary jobs. The previous order I had done most of the hand stacking, which was fine, while he had been somehow nowhere to be found till the very end. It's okay, stuff happens. But it was a pattern with him, and our supervisor never seemed to hound him for it. So now he's doing the heavy lifting, and I have the option to immediately join him and help, or let my own muscles rest for a minute by doing a different necessary job of tying off the tops of fully loaded pallets before jumping in. I chose the latter, still physical, but not as. By the time I was done, he was still stacking. I knew there was only room for 2 to stack at a time, and I looked to the other guys to see if they might help instead, but they were still finishing up their own jobs. Since I was earliest done, I figured I should just help him and get it over with. I walk over, grab a box, break the glue that holds it to the other boxes so the entire stack doesn't fall apart, and get ready to lift. That's when he said it. "You might as well let me finish it myself." For whatever reason, this had been a thing my supervisor had been saying the last few days when coworkers had been slow, kind of teasing them, but also trying to light a fire too. So here's him borrowing my supervisor's line, directing it at me. I could see he was angry and felt justified. I froze, box in hand, glue half broken, and looked up at him. Okay. He wasn't just telling you to step back, he was trying to perform. He was parroting the boss's line, hoping to mimic authority and shame you into compliance. He didn't realize he was setting a stage he'd have to stand on alone. I let the box fall and walked across the dock to where I now see the rest of my coworkers and my supervisor watching us. Their work was done, and they were all standing there waiting for Shane to finally be done with his. I just realized they'd seen and heard everything, and I expected my soup to chew me out because he'd always been adamant about not letting stupid arguments get in the way of our job. He didn't say a word. None of them did. I maintained a calm, casual pace across the dock, almost feeling Shane's eyes. We might as well call him Shane because why choose a fake name at this point? Bore holes into my back. Then I joined the rest of them to watch Shane finish his stack. It was only a couple more minutes, but it was glorious. It was as if we were all just taking a moment before the next order, but no one else crossed that dock to join him. I watched as the moment stretched, box after box, and could almost see his mind trying to work out what exactly had just happened, like gears spinning but not engaging. I worked a lot of crappy jobs with not always the best of people, but this is a moment I keep coming back to. It makes me smile. Your supervisor's quiet was the verdict. By not intervening, he wasn't just allowing it, he was endorsing it. Shane's borrowed line turned into a binding contract, and the entire crew became witnesses to his solo performance. His win was a punishment everyone silently agreed he'd earned. And our second story, the Great Kilt Revolt, how IT used fashion to expose a micromanaging CIO's double standards. When the company announced we were getting a new CIO, most of us in IT were cautiously optimistic. We'd been without a permanent head for a while, and morale was hanging in that familiar limbo where nobody knows which rules matter anymore. Then we learned who the hire actually was, and optimism quietly packed its bags and left. The new CIO hadn't been one of the finalists from the selection committee. In fact, they hadn't even been close. What they were was a longtime friend of the CEO parachuted into the role with a resume that looked thin for the scope of responsibility. Whatever they lacked in hands-on experience or technical competence, they more than made up for in micromanagement and an obsession with professionalism, the superficial kind that focuses on appearances rather than outcomes. Within their first couple of weeks, the new CIO rolled out a dress code policy that hadn't existed before. No shorts, no ripped jeans, no graphic t-shirts, business casual at minimum, and especially for supervisors. On paper, it sounded reasonable enough. In practice, it was laughably disconnected from how our department actually functioned. Several of us were supervisors, but we weren't desk-only managers. We ran cabling, unloaded equipment, crawled under raised floors and server rooms, and spent long hours in buildings with questionable air conditioning during the summer. It wasn't uncommon to be covered in dust, sweat, or both before lunchtime. A few of us approached management and asked for a practical exception. We weren't asking to wear gym shorts to executive meetings. We were asking to wear shorts while unloading racks, installing cable trays, or rewiring buildings where the temperature regularly hit uncomfortable levels. Every request was denied. Uniformity mattered more than common sense. The CIO made it clear that professionalism required sacrifice, and apparently that sacrifice was going to be made by people sweating in mechanical rooms. After one particularly unproductive meeting about this, we walked out into the open office area and noticed something that hadn't escaped anyone's attention before. The CIO's secretary, along with several women in office support roles, were wearing skirts or skorts. Perfectly office appropriate, perfectly compliant with the policy, and functionally identical to shorts. We brought this up at the next meeting, carefully and calmly, pointing out the inconsistency. The response we got was vague reassurance that it was different for reasons that were never clearly articulated. Nobody pushed further in that moment, but the seed was planted. To be clear, none of the women in IT were about to start wearing skirts while pulling cable or climbing ladders, but a couple of them did start wearing skorts, which were explicitly allowed and technically complied with the policy. That alone caused some raised eyebrows, but nothing changed. The CIO remained unmoved, confident in the righteousness of their rulebook. Around this time, I was procrastinating one evening by scrolling through my old Think Geek wish list, which should tell you roughly how long ago this was. Buried among the gadgets and novelty mugs was something I'd added years earlier as a joke, a utilikilt. For those unfamiliar, it's exactly what it sounds like, a rugged, pocket-heavy kilt marketed toward tradespeople and tech workers who want airflow and functionality. I stared at it for about 5 seconds, connected the dots, and ordered it immediately. Then I messaged a few of my closest coworkers, explained the situation, and watched as several of them had the same realization I did. Orders were placed, shipping notifications followed. The following Monday, we showed up to work wearing kilts, not costume kilts, not novelty kilts, proper utilikilts paired with collared shirts and work boots. Technically business casual from the waist up, technically not shorts, and undeniably compliant with the letter of the policy. The reaction from our co-workers was immediate. There was laughter, double takes, and more than a few phones discreetly snapping photos. Our manager, a genuinely good person trying to survive under the new CIO, took one look, shook his head, and said nothing. He knew exactly what we were doing and wasn't about to step in front of that train. Fate, or perhaps sheer comedic timing, decided this was the perfect day for the CIO's computer to break. A Windows update had completely bricked their system, and they needed someone to look at it immediately. I wasn't technically on call for that issue, but I volunteered before anyone else could. I walked into the CIO's office wearing my kilt, tools in hand, and got to work. The CIO stared at me the entire time, clearly processing several emotions at once. I fixed the issue quickly, explained what had gone wrong in professional, neutral terms, and left without commenting on the situation. The silence was deafening. By fixing the CIO's own computer while dressed that way, you turned their office into a stage for their own inconsistency. You gave them exactly what they demanded, professionalism and compliance, while showing them how hollow their definition really was. Not long after, my manager messaged me asking for a private conversation. He was clearly uncomfortable, but straightforward. The CIO had complained kilts, according to their interpretation, violated the no shorts policy. I responded calmly that kilts were not shorts, and if skirts and skirts were acceptable for some employees, then this should be acceptable as well. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't argue aggressively, I simply pointed out the inconsistency and left it there. Full disclosure, I was in a unique position. I had a very specific skill set that was both critical and difficult to replace. I knew it, my manager knew it, and the CIO probably knew it too. I was willing to be the lightning rod because I could afford to be. If there were consequences, they wouldn't land the way the CIO might have hoped. Over the next few weeks, we didn't wear kilts every day, but we were selective. Anytime we had visibility outside the IT department, cross-team meetings, infrastructure work in shared spaces, walkthroughs with facilities, we made sure at least one of us was wearing a kilt. Other departments noticed. Reactions ranged from laughter to playful teasing to genuine curiosity. A surprising number of people expressed support, framing it as a fair response to a poorly thought-out policy. Eventually, the noise reached a level the CIO couldn't ignore. An all-hands meeting was scheduled. The policy, we were told, was being amended. Managers would now be allowed to grant situational exceptions for things like infrastructure maintenance and physical labor. Additionally, Fridays would become casual days, still no shorts, but more relaxed attire overall. The unspoken understanding was clear. In exchange, the kilts needed to quietly disappear. We mostly complied. The kilts went back into closets and drawers, brought out only occasionally and strategically. The policy became marginally more reasonable, and day-to-day life returned to something resembling normal. The CIO never addressed the incident directly again, but their grip on micromanagement loosened just a bit. Every now and then, on particularly hot days or during especially tedious maintenance work, someone would mutter, "Kilt day would fix this," and we'd all grin. The utility-kilts hadn't just been about airflow or technical compliance. They'd been about reminding leadership that rules divorced from reality will eventually collide with it. Sometimes politely, sometimes wearing cargo pockets and pleats. And our last story. I'm the boss now. Get out. In my early 20s, I packed up what little I owned and moved to a new city with the kind of optimism you only have when you're young and don't yet realize how expensive ambition can be. I was determined to start a career, build a life, and prove to myself more than anyone else that I could make it on my own. What I didn't have was money. Rent ate most of what I had saved, groceries were a careful math problem, and every dollar mattered. I remember standing in my tiny apartment, counting coins on the kitchen counter, telling myself it was temporary and that things would turn around soon. During one of my many job searches, I came across an opening at a small firm. I'll call it the firm because that's exactly how it felt at the time: formal, intimidating, and just out of reach. I made it through the initial interview, and instead of offering me the job outright, the owner smiled and suggested a trial. He told me he wanted me to come in for 2 full days, work alongside the team, and see if it was a good fit. If it was, I'd be hired. If it wasn't, they'd still pay me for the 2 days. He said it like it was generous, like he was doing me a favor. I hesitated because 2 unpaid days would have hurt, but the promise of being paid made it doable. I agreed immediately. That night I did the math again and realized something sobering. Even bus fare twice a day for those 2 days had put me into the red. I stood there staring at my wallet and made the decision to walk. It was about an hour each way, but it was late summer, and I told myself it'd be fine. I showed up early both days, sweaty, tired, but determined to prove I was worth the effort. I worked hard, genuinely hard. I stayed focused, asked smart questions, and did everything I could to contribute. I watched how the team operated, learned their systems, and made sure I didn't waste anyone's time. At the end of the second day, the owner called me into his office. He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and told me it wasn't the right fit. I was disappointed, but I understood. Not every job works out. Then he added almost casually, "About the pay. We said we'd compensate you, but it's just too complicated to set you up in payroll for only 2 days. You'll just have to be happy you got the experience." I remember the room going very quiet. I didn't even know what to say at first. I told him calmly that he'd promised I'd be paid. He shrugged and repeated that it was just too much trouble. He said something about how I should be grateful for the exposure and the opportunity to learn from them. The way he said it made my stomach turn. I needed that money. I had earned that money, but I also knew I was new in town, desperate for work, and that making a scene could follow me. So I nodded, thanked him for his time, and walked out. And then I walked the hour home, furious, humiliated, and broke. The owner scam was subtle. He didn't yell or steal, he simply redefined your effort. Experience became the currency he offered, knowing you couldn't refuse it. It was the slow bleed of hope, and you paid for it in bus fare you couldn't afford and sweat you couldn't spare. I never forgot that feeling. I never forgot his tone or the way he dismissed my time and effort like it was nothing. I moved on because I had to. I found another job, then a better one. That led to another opportunity and another. Over the years, my career grew in ways I couldn't have imagined back then. I gained experience, built a reputation, and eventually found myself working for a large national company instead of scraping by at small firms. But I kept an eye on the owner. I didn't obsess, but every so often I'd look him up, see where the firm was, how it was doing. Part of me always thought maybe one day there'd be a moment, some small, harmless way to balance the scales. I even toyed with petty ideas over the years, but I never acted on them. Life got busy. Success has a way of doing that. Then, almost 20 years later, the moment arrived on its own. By then, I was senior leadership at my company. We were putting out a major contract in the region where the firm operated, and I was the executive lead on the procurement team. This wasn't a symbolic role. I was deeply involved in the process. Back in the early 2000s, firms had to absorb the full cost of bidding on contracts like this, hundreds of hours of work with no guarantee of a payoff. To be fair, the process was broken into stages, but it was still expensive and time-consuming. When I saw the firm's name come across my desk as an exploratory bidder, I laughed out loud. They were qualified, not perfect, but capable. I could have quietly shut them down in the first round and no one would have questioned it, but I didn't. I helped move them to the next stage and the next. Each round required more work, more analysis, more resources on their end. I played it straight the whole way, because if they ended up being the best option, I would have voted for them. Revenge wasn't worth compromising my integrity. In the end, another firm edged them out. The difference wasn't massive, but it was clear enough that the decision was easy. Normally, the executive lead doesn't deliver the rejection call, but I volunteered. No one questioned it. When I got the owner on the phone, his voice was professional, hopeful. I told him we'd been impressed with their proposal, but that it wasn't the right fit. I said I knew it was disappointing not to win the contract, but that at least they'd gained valuable exposure to our process. I kept my tone pleasant, almost kind. He thanked me and hung up. He never knew who I was. He never knew that the person calmly rejecting his firm had once walked an hour each way to work for him, unpaid. I didn't need him to know. I'd done the math afterward and figured they'd probably sunk around 200 hours into that bid. Compared to my 16 unpaid hours with 20 years of interest, I'd say the universe finally balanced the books. Sometimes revenge doesn't need a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it just looks like a polite phone call, a closed bid, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing you waited long enough for the right moment. When you really sit with these three stories, what jumps out isn't the conflict, it's the miscalculation. Shane thought authority was something you could borrow like a catchphrase. The moment he said it out loud, the crew let him own it completely. The CIO thought control lived in policies and appearances until compliance exposed how shallow that control actually was. And the owner believed power meant never having to pay for someone else's time, forgetting that unpaid labor doesn't disappear, it compounds. So guys, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a new video every single day. Thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.